Hello, so today I'm going to talk to you about interactions between populations, and the objectives are to know about population dynamics. So we'll have a little think, have a bit of a recap about population dynamics, and think about the effect of different interactions between those populations. So we looked a couple of weeks ago, so before we broke up, at the things that determine the size of the population. And we talked about this idea of carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is the maximum population size that is sustainable for a particular organism, represented by the letter K here. And the size of the population is going to depend on a balance between mortality, so mortality rate, death rate, and the rate of reproduction. So with the lag phase, you get a little bit of growth. So the growth rate, the reproductive rate, is greater than the death rate, but actually the population doesn't go up that much. And this is what happens at the very start. So when a population is starting to get used to its surroundings, acclimatizing to habitat, and there might be things like making the right enzymes to be able to metabolize the substrate, the food that's available there to them. Once they get established, then they can go into that exponential growth phase. So exponential growth phase, otherwise known as the log phase, is this phase here where you get a really steep increase in the population. So they've become acclimatized, they've got used to the surroundings, their habitat, and their reproductive rate now is very high. So reproductive rate, they're much higher than the death rate. And then they get to a point where the growth rate, the reproductive rate, and the death rate are equal to each other, and we call that the stationary phase. So population is going to stay the same because the death rate and the birth rate are equal to one another. And if they're in a closed environment, so if it's something like bacteria, for instance, that have got a finite amount of resources, if they're in a closed environment, then they'll start to use up their resources, and the death rate becomes greater than the rate of reproduction. So they go into this decline phase or death phase, and the population starts to decline as it runs out of resources. And another recap then is the idea of the K strategists and R strategists. So some organisms are K strategists, and that means they're limited by this K, the carrying capacity of that particular population. So it's determined by that carrying capacity. Something like birds, large mammals, larger plants, they would be K strategists. If they've got a long life cycle, they're likely to be K strategists. On the other hand, you've got R strategists. So R strategists really take advantage of the resources that are available to them, and they'll go through this boom and bust population growth where they exceed that carrying capacity, use up their resources, and then go into a death phase, so or the decline phase and the bust. And that would be things with a really fast reproductive strategy, so something like mice, insects, spiders, weeds, short life cycle, fast reproductive strategy, and they're taking advantage of the good conditions that they've got at that moment in time. And those populations then are affected by lots of different limiting factors. So some of those limiting factors are what we call density dependent factors. In other words, if you've got a higher population, they might have more of an effect than if you've got a smaller population. So things like predation, availability of resources, nutrient supply, disease, and accumulation of waste, those are density dependent factors. So the higher the population, the more the effect that factor has on the particular population. There are some factors that we call density independent factors. So those are things like phenomena, so natural disasters. Doesn't matter how big or small the population is, that's going to have an impact on that population. Abiotic factors, so temperature and carbon dioxide level, for instance, is going to affect the population, whether you've got a large population or a small population. And weather conditions, so floods and storms and things like that, are going to have an impact on the population, whether you've got a big population or a small population. So this is the mnemonic from the Bio Ninja website, which is a revision website, which is really good. And they've got this PANDA PAW. So the PANDA, predator, availability of resources, nutrient supply, disease, accumulation of waste, the density dependent factors, and PAW, phenomena, abiotic factors, and weather conditions for the density independent factors. So we're going to look more about interactions between different populations. So we're looking at things between like predation, so predator and prey interactions, and competition. So that's to do with availability of resources, competition for different resources. So that's what we're going to be looking at a little bit more now. Starting off then with the predator and prey populations. So you can see here that you've got this staggered effect. As your prey population starts to increase, predators have got more food available to them. So the predator population will start to increase. And then when the predator population gets too high, they eat the prey, and the prey population then starts to decline. And then the predator population, as a result of that, would start to decline as well, because there's less prey available to them. And they go through this cyclical pattern. So actually, a lot of these graphs, the data is not necessarily representative of what would happen in real life, so in a real situation. This particular graph here is from a lab experiment. So obviously it was a closed environment where it was just the predator and the prey that were affecting one another. But obviously out in the wild you would have other factors involved, other things that are going to have an impact on those populations. So question 48 then, you've got this graph here. The one that you've got actually is in black and white, so you might want to pause this video so you can put some colour onto your graph. And again, you can see that cyclical pattern which has got this staggered effect. So predator population increases because there's plenty of prey. They eat the prey and the prey population decreases, so there's less food. Predator population then also decreases, fewer prey are eaten, so the prey population starts to increase, and then because there's more prey, predator population then starts to increase. And this cycle continues over time. Now this data is quite interesting because this is based on the number of pelts sold. So obviously ethical concerns with the way in which this data was gathered, but also it's going to be dependent on the success of the people that are out hunting. There might be more people out hunting and therefore they're going to catch more, and that might not necessarily be representative of the population as a whole. So maybe doing something like either camera trap or capture recapture would be a much better way of looking at this. So I'd probably use camera trap for the lynx populations and a capture recapture method for the snowshoe hare, so you can look at that. So yeah, so there's lots and lots of data out there, but that data is not necessarily reliable data, so you have to look at how that data has actually been gathered and whether it is representative of those populations. So there are lots of different types of competition. I deliberately left my door open so we could hear the birds. I don't know if you can hear the birds. And there is fierce competition between bird populations. I know in my garden we've got bird feeders just like this, and we see the different birds coming in. They tend to actually have different time slots, so they're coming at different points. There are certainly some birds that are more dominant than others. We've got a fat pigeon that likes to come and feed off the bird feeder, and obviously if he's around then the blue tits are nowhere to be seen. And then we've got a couple of magpies that like to just bully all the other birds in the area. So they're very territorial and they're competing for habitat in that area. So with different types of competition, you've got intra-specific competition. So intra means within. So that's within the same species, within members of the same species. And it keeps population size relatively stable, keeps it at that sort of stationary phase, at the carrying capacity. And that could be competition for all kinds of things. It could be competition for food, for mates, for habitats or breeding sites and things like that. And there is a lot of interspecific competition. The other type of competition is inter. So inter means between. The interspecific competition then is between individuals of different species. And it can affect the size of populations, but also the distribution of species within a particular ecosystem. And the example I've got here, we've got two of these beetle, the T. castaneum and the T. confusum, and you can see that the T. confusum gets completely outcompeted. So they have got the same niche. You can see that they're quite similar to each other. So they have got the same niche, which means that they are in direct competition. Now, no two species can occupy the same niche. So what happens is you get this competitive exclusion, and one of those species is going to go into decline and eventually be completely outcompeted and go from that particular habitat. And you can see in this example here that that's exactly what's happened to the T. confusum. The T. castaneum wants to compete, and so it goes through this bust, so boom and bust. You can see that the population increases very, very rapidly here, and then it completely outcompetes that T. confusum, and the T. confusum population then dies out completely, and then that castaneum population starts to increase again at this point here. So that's an example of interspecific competition. Another good example of that is with these Paramecium species. So again, this is another example of competitive exclusion, but this is quite interesting because you've got two different graphs here. You've got graph A. So graph A represents the population dynamics if they are by themselves. So they don't have any competition from another species. And you can see here that you get your exponential growth phase there, and then they both go into this stationary phase. The P. aurelia there actually goes very quickly into the exponential growth phase here. P. caudatum then has a bit more of a lag phase before it goes into the exponential growth phase, and then the carrying capacity for that one, it gets to that carrying capacity in the stationary phase a lot earlier than the P. aurelia. If we look at graph B, that represents what happens when you put them in together and they're competing for the same resources. So they've got the same habitat, they've got the same food supplies, and the P. caudatum actually switches to become an R strategist in this case. So it's like, okay, I've got some competition here, I'm going to take advantage of those resources, and it goes straight into the exponential growth phase. So there's no lag phase there, straight into the exponential growth phase, but then it gets outcompeted, and it goes through this boom, the bust phase just here. So yeah, the P. aurelia, actually the graph is fairly similar here. So it does grow at a slower rate to begin with because of the competition from the P. caudatum, but it does go into the exponential growth phase, and it eventually is going to outcompete the P. caudatum. So we've got competitive exclusion taking place here. So you get this really intense competition that means that in this case, the P. caudatum has been wiped out from that particular area, been outcompeted for food. And not only do they have competition for resources, but sometimes you get, well, I suppose this is a response to competition between resources. Sometimes you get chemicals being released from organisms. In this case, we're thinking about plants. So here, the plants can release chemicals that actually will decrease the growth of other plants around them. So they've got less competition for things like light and other resources as well. That's called allelopathy. So they might inhibit growth, they might prevent germination of particular seeds, or they might prevent nutrient uptake by other plants. Okay, so have a go at questions 46 to 51 in your ecosystems booklet, and I will speak to you later on this week. Bye.